Today we want to consider the issue of a scientist who's thrown into the policy world, perhaps with not a lot of experience or background. How do you present science to policymakers, the public, in a way that's not only accurate, but effective and useful? A lot of us don't have much experience in this area, and so the first few times can be pretty disquieting in terms of the proper role and mistakes and errors that a person can make if you're not familiar with it. Well, how does science fit into the policy and political world? Now, many of us don't have much experience, and so we can get into trouble very quickly unless we recognize some of the pitfalls. Right off the top, the first issue to look at is that scientific information is a particular type of information, but it is only one type, and arguably it's not even the most important type of information that policymakers use. There's lots of other factors that go into making a public policy choice and decision. Scientific information is very important. It's brought to you by people who are scientists, and it's the appropriate type of information for scientists to present. But remember that it's only one of many types. What is this thing we call science or scientific information? First of all, it's information that's gathered according to the scientific method, which was popularized by Francis Bacon several hundred years ago. But it's information that has four characteristics. And so if the information you're talking about or presenting does not have these four characteristics, it is not science. It may be great information, it may be useful information, but it's not science. The four characteristics of scientific information: first, it's rational. That is, that it relies on the senses, either instruments or our visual or auditory senses. It's systematic. That is, it's gathered in a way that's describable and you can explain to somebody, you can write about it, you can publish it, and it's testable. That is, other people can go out and test whether your information is accurate or not and how it was gathered. Fourth, its information is science if it's reproducible. That is, if you repeat the experiments, you repeat the analytical techniques, you come up with the same answer within a range of statistical error. So information that is called science is rational, it's systematic, it's testable, and it's reproducible. If it doesn't have those four characteristics, it may be very useful to policymakers, but it's not science. Well, what about the scientist who's confronted with the first opportunity to present information to a board, a policymaker, or others? And here we have a situation of a panel of policymakers who are receiving information from a group of scientists, those sitting at the front table plus the speaker. If this is the first time you're involved, the role may be confusing, and it's important to get your act together, to get your thinking together about the proper role of science before you're confronted with an issue, particularly if it's an issue that's very divisive. Well, I've learned a number of rules from working at the science policy interface over the years, and some of those learning opportunities were painful. And here's an example. Here we have a scientist at the table in the back left corner presenting to a group of policy makers. Those are the ones sitting at the table in the front of the room, and to a group of interested folks who have some interest in the topic at hand. Perhaps they've got a vested interest, it'll affect their livelihood, and so on. So what should that scientist up there presenting information do to be effective as a scientist? Well, I've identified 7 rules which I recommend that people follow if they're confronted with this type of information. The first rule: be fair when conveying science. What you want to do is definitely do not lie, but most scientists don't lie intentionally, but also you want to focus on what the public or the policymakers actually hear. You may intend to convey information in a certain way, but if people don't interpret it that way, the communication hasn't been effective. And you need to tell the whole truth. Leaving out information that's relevant to the policy question on the table is not perhaps quite as bad as lying about the information, but it's not good. It misleads the reader or the listener or the policymaker or the public. So you want to be fair and convey all the relevant information to the topic. Rule 2. Focused on the science that you can provide, not pushing your policy preferences or your employer's policy preferences. Watch for hidden assumptions. Avoid implicit policy advocacy. You need to be careful that your science and the way you present it is well thought through to avoid leading the policymaker to a particular policy preference that either you or your employer thinks is the appropriate one. And avoid implied policy preferences. Science deals with the proverbial is question. This is the way the world is. If you adopt policy A, the world will likely be this way. If you adopt policy B, the effect will likely to be this. Science does not deal with the shoulds. This is the way the world should be. This is the choice that you ought to make. Those are not scientific questions. Those are policy-making questions, which are driven by many, many factors, of which science is only one. Rule 3. Accept the fact that decision makers, policymakers, covet legitimacy. Most policymakers, either directly or indirectly, are dependent upon the electoral process for their positions. There's nothing wrong with that. That's how democracy works. But recognize that a lot of choices that policymakers make will, by their definition, create lots of folks that are unhappy. And you have to recognize that they may want to try to hide behind the science or hide behind the scientists as they make these difficult choices. Society, generally speaking, tends to revere credentials, academic degrees. And I think scientists particularly should be very careful not to abuse this trust. You're trusted because it's perceived that you present impartial scientific information. You're not usually mandated to make policy choices. My advice to science is don't get involved in answering questions like, what should we do about this particular policy question? What is your opinion on what the best choice would be? These are not questions that scientists are in a position to answer because they involve many, many factors that are far outside the purview of science. Rule 4. Remember that framing, structuring the question largely defines the answer. First, I spent a lot of time working on the salmon issues, policy issues over the years. But who defines this as a salmon issue? It could just as easily have been defined as, gee, what should we do about K-12 education? Perhaps we ought to spend more money on universities. The person who defines it as a salmon question is generally a policymaker or somebody who's concerned about policy issues, not a scientist. So setting priorities, that is how the money is spent, what's important to deal with, is a political or policy decision, not one for scientists to make. And recognize that as important as you might think your particular research area is, when it comes to spending money, when it comes to making choices, there are many, many factors to go into the process, not purely scientific information. Rule 5, avoid normative science. And by normative science, I mean science that looks like science, that sounds like science. It's usually presented by people who call themselves science, but the information has an embedded policy preference. It's not impartial or policy neutral science, it's policy biased science. For example, here we have a golf course in a forested area. Now, scientifically, would you describe this area as degraded or, the same area, improved? Well, obviously, if the policy perspective was that you want a golf course in this area, the area is improved. Or if you perceive this area should have been left in its, quote, natural state, it could be defined, the same area, as degraded. Those are not scientific judgments. Those are policy judgments. Scientifically, the area is certainly different than it would be without a golf course, but it's not better or worse until you apply a policy preference. So play fair in public policy as you present science. Don't get involved in stealth or hidden advocacy. Stay away from normative science. Play at science straight up. And I recommend adopting the physician as advisor model. When you go to your doctor, your physician, the problem is assessed, your doctor looks at it and says, hey, you've got three options. Option one is this, here's the probability it'll work, here's what I think will happen if you do it, option two, and so on. At the end of the day, it's your choice which option you go with. Your physician is there as a resource person, but he's not there to make a decision for you. And I think the same ought to be for the role of a scientist. Your scientist's role is to advise. If you do option A, here my guess is what the consequences will be. If you do option B, here's what's likely to occur. At the end of the day, it's up to the policymaker or the decision maker or the public to decide which of those options is preferable, not a scientist. Rule 6. Concede, recognize that societal priorities change, and that change is not inherently good or bad, it just is. For example, society preferences have changed over wolves. Here we have a situation in this photograph, wolf hides that were captured quite a few years ago, perhaps 100 years ago, and in fact there was a bounty on these wolves because public policy was to eradicate them. They kill a lot of livestock and other things, and people wanted to get rid of them. Nothing wrong with that choice, it's a choice. These days, in a lot of areas, wolves are actually efforts are made to actively introduce these wolves, changing policy priority. Neither is right or wrong, they're just different policy priorities. And it's not up to scientists to decide which is the better policy choice. So keep in mind that policy decisions do change over time, and that's not really a problem. You just have to recognize that they do change, and it can be for many reasons, one of which maybe more scientific information changes people's mind, or people's values just simply change. Final rule, Rule 7, avoid scientific hubris. Scientific hubris or technological hubris is really the idea that all of a sudden a tool or technique or an approach comes online that's going to solve the problems. It rarely happens. Policymaking is all about picking winners and losers. The sad choice is that policymaking is controversial because every policy option on a table has winners and losers, and invariably the losers for each of those policy choices recognize they will be losers and they will be extremely unhappy about it. For example, here we have a fishway on a river in Oregon, and the idea of fishways when they came out perhaps 100 years ago was they could, quote, solve the salmon problem. And there is no doubt that fishways allow passage of salmon around dams, but it's not as good as a free-flowing river from a salmon perspective. So it may be a useful tool in fisheries management, salmon management, but it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve all the problems. So looking for a win-win in policy debates is not going to happen. Read history more carefully, and if you come up with some great technological or scientific breakthrough, it's very, very unlikely that it'll, quote, solve the problem, and it definitely will not create winners all around. Let me wrap up with a conclusion from a real-world case study. Here we have Vanport, which was a town right next to Portland, Oregon. In 1948, in this photograph, Vanport was wiped out when the major flood of that year occurred up and down the coast, particularly in British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon, and it flooded lots of places along lots of rivers. And Vanport was essentially wiped out. Now, politically, policy-wise, what's the solution? Well, one solution on the table was we got to build more dams in the Columbia and elsewhere to dampen these floods. They're causing, over the years, many, many really expensive and catastrophic effects. We got to do something. And so the political decision was made post-1948 to build quite a few dams up and down the Columbia, including 3 large ones in British Columbia. And there's no doubt that those dams dampen the effect of the floods, reduce the adverse effects on humans and so on. But they also had a major effect on salmon runs. There's really no great surprise about this. People pretty much knew the trade-offs. There's no easy way to build dams and make them completely neutral so far as salmon goes. Was that a good or bad choice? We have less adverse floods these days, but we also have worse salmon runs. Again, that's not a scientific decision. Science can provide input to that process and useful input, but it will not make the trade-offs between flood damage and salmon runs. Let me wrap up and conclude with some advice. If you haven't been involved as a scientist in the policy world, I recommend that you think hard about the proper role of science before you're confronted for the first time with one of these controversial issues. When you're being badgered on all sides as you present your science, you want to have it clear in your mind what is the proper role of science in the policy world. Thank you.